What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of JT Sports Live. I'm your host, JT, here to talk about the chaos that was week 13 of the college football season. We saw several ranked teams fall to unranked teams in upset fashion. This just was a crazy weekend. I mean, Texas A&M and Auburn played in the greatest game I've ever watched. 2-point overtime shootout to win it. Auburn comes through with the big win at home. Meanwhile, Alabama just runs into a nightmare in Norman. I wasn't even expecting to have to watch or pay too much attention to Alabama or Oklahoma with how the Sooners have looked for the majority of this season. Zero offense, no defense. I was not expecting Alabama to lose that game, even if it was a close game, because playing on the road is weird in the SEC. I was not expecting for that to happen to Alabama. I can't say their playoff hopes are over because after this weekend, let's just be real. I don't know. You don't know. Nobody knows who's about to make it to the playoffs. Even the committee doesn't know who they're about to put into the playoffs. And the crazy thing is, we get so mad at the committee for who's ranked where, who's too high, who's too low, who's overrated. But be honest, if me and you were in those seats, we wouldn't be able to do any better. Everybody would have something to say because at this point, what do you go off? Are you going off strength of schedule? Are you going off the wins? Because I mean, there's teams that haven't really beat that many good teams, that have lost to bad teams. It's like Tennessee, they lost to Georgia, but they beat Alabama. Are you still going to put them in at this point? It's no debate about if Indiana should be in or not because I mean Alabama lost, Ole Miss lost. You can't put nobody that's a 3-loss team in over Indiana. And what 3-loss team is going to make it? Because now with all of the chaos that's happened, you mean to say that Clemson and South Carolina don't have a chance to get in? That game could decide who gets another playoff spot. This whole thing is madness. We got to discuss all of the chaos that transpired this Saturday, man. Ohio State ended Indiana's Cinderella run. The Colorado haters are finally popping out again. We haven't heard from them in, over 2 months? Well, they're back and they're chirping their mouths after Colorado falls to Kansas. The SEC, man, they just got humbled in the worst way. Shout out to everybody that's tuned in wherever you're watching, YouTube, X, Facebook. Appreciate you for tuning in. We late night on a early Sunday morning recapping the week 13 chaos. Smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, hit that bell icon so you don't miss when we drop new content and when we go live. Check us out, all podcasting platforms, Apple, Amazon, Spotify. The links are down in the description down below. If you enjoyed tonight's show, give us a 5-star review. Shout out to our guy John Kennedy with the $2 donation. He's a Longhorns fan. He says, love the games, bro. Hey, I appreciate you with the donation. Shout out to Zachary Clark. He says War Eagle. Shout out to DYM. He says the biggest questions for Tuesday with the rankings is, with Alabama and Ole Miss out, does that save a spot for Indiana? And would UGA be punished for a possible third loss in the SEC championship game? Iron Bowl predictions. Shout out to Sloops. He says go Bucks. To answer your question, DYM, how do we know if Alabama and Ole Miss are out? Because if this much chaos happened this weekend, how can we assume more chaos isn't about to happen next weekend? We don't know who can lose to who anymore. I don't think we should question if Georgia, or I don't think it's crazy to question if Georgia will win against Georgia Tech next week. I don't think it's fair to just guarantee a lot of these teams are going to be in because Georgia could lose to Georgia Tech. It may sound crazy, but you really can't deny any outcome at this point because look what just happened this season. You don't know who can beat who. You don't know who can lose to who. So for all we know, Georgia Tech just might upset Georgia next week. What about if Vanderbilt upsets Tennessee? There's more upsets that are going to happen that's going to make this playoff picture more murkier than what it already is. Because every week just seems to be an absolute war in the SEC for some reason. But let's dive into it. Texas A&M and Auburn randomly decided to play in the greatest college football game that I have ever watched in my lifetime. So when I first tuned into this game, it was because A&M was down 21-0. I was already tapped into the Alabama nightmare in Norman, them getting down to Oklahoma. And then I was like, bro, Texas A&M's losing to the SEC chooses this time to fall apart after I spent all week long defending the honor of this conference. So then I tune in, and Texas A&M, they end up rolling, and then they end up scoring 21 unanswered to tie the game back up 21-21. But then Auburn takes the lead late in the third quarter. They go up 28-21, and then you're saying to yourself, okay, it looks like Auburn's about to win this thing. They have all the momentum. They have their home crowd going absolutely berserk. And then all of a sudden, A&M takes control of the ball game. They proceed to score 10 straight unanswered, but they gave Auburn some time late in the game to go downfield and to send it to OT. And I didn't even think that Auburn was going to send it to OT. I outright thought that Auburn was going to win this game because although they had no timeouts, they were in a position where you didn't need to go to overtime to try to win it. You just could have went for the kill and attempted to just score a touchdown in that situation. They nearly did if it wasn't for the costly penalty that they had. But the kicker comes through, he sends it to OT, and then in overtime, it's going back and forth. We end up somehow having to go to instant death, pretty much 2-point conversion, shootout for the win. Whoever gets their 2-point try and the other gets stopped wins the ball game. A&M, Peyton Thorne makes a crazy throw, and it's an even better catch by Lambert Smith. And then all the pressure is on Texas A&M. So they cook up somewhat of their version of the Philly special. And for a second, it looks like we're about to go to another overtime period because at this point, we've already went to 3-4 overtimes. Hell, this game has already been so fun to watch. I wouldn't mind watching the 3 extra overtime periods of this game, although it may be a little bit stupid that it comes down to a 2-point try contest to see who wins it. I mean, football is football. This game is an instant classic. Yeah, give me some more of this. Well, unfortunately, the bad news is we didn't get to see more of this game because number 5 for Texas A&M, he dropped the pass that would have extended this game, and I just felt so bad for him. He's laying on the ground. Everybody's just staring, and all the fans come running out of the stands. They invade the field, and it's just college football, man. This is sports at its finest. I mean, A&M to even get in this point was insane. They were down 21-0. You thought that Auburn was about to run these boys out of Jordan-Hare Stadium. And I took Auburn to cover in this game. And when I was talking to my homeboys about it, they thought that it was insane due to how bad Auburn has been. But it's just something magical about that damn stadium, man. When you play in Jordan-Hare, they just have games where, yeah, they may end up having a surprising loss, but they have some games where they play some of their best football, and you can just never count out Auburn. This game shows you that the SEC is just completely unhinged. It's just random. War is about to take place in any SEC game that you tune into, and we've gotten somewhat of the parity that we've been seeking in college football. It just somehow has happened in the SEC because, I mean, all of these SEC teams are talented. But the question is, you don't know who can beat who. You cannot judge any team by what their record shows. And this game is the perfect example of that. You would have thought that A&M would have cruised in here, got an easy win, but instead they end up falling in the overtime shootout, all-time classic, 43-41. The good thing is they still control their playoff destiny. If they beat Texas next week, they got a ticket to the SEC championship to go up against Georgia. And if they win that game, then they get a automatic spot into the playoffs. And for Auburn, I mean, listen, with the way Alabama was looking tonight, you got a good chance to win the Iron Bowl and go bowling this season, and the season that, Auburn hasn't been as bad as what their record shows. Because believe it or not, like, they had a lot of games that they could have won. They just beat themselves. They had some games that they had like 4 or 5 turnovers. And, even those games with all those turnovers still were winnable. And you just had some games that came down to, one last possession that things just went the opposite way. But if we were to, reverse some of Auburn's outcomes this year, maybe they're a 3-loss team. But this was one of the greatest, if not the greatest game that I have ever watched in the regular season. The second greatest game I think I recall was when Notre Dame and Florida State had played back in 2013. And Notre Dame, it looked like they were about to win, but it was a costly offensive pass interference that was called. Florida State gets a stop, and they end up winning. But this game tops that. I just don't know how to describe how awesome of a game this was. Oh boy, where do we start from here? I guess we got to start off with Alabama. So Alabama, they incur or so Alabama walks into a nightmare in Norman, Oklahoma tonight. They fall 24-3 to the Sooners. It looks like their playoff hopes are all but over. And this was so random of a game for Alabama to play their worst football because after they lost to Tennessee and they destroyed LSU on the road, they destroyed Missouri, you would have thought that this team was back heading in the right direction. They were going to cruise to the college football playoffs because Oklahoma was on the verge of having the worst season that they've had in 26 years. And you know how Oklahoma won this game is that their defense, which has kept them in the majority of close games that they've been in, played absolutely incredible tonight. Jalen Milroe, when he can't run, he sucks at quarterback. He can't throw accurately. He makes really bad decisions, and he's a one-read quarterback. I saw Colin Cowherd put a tweet out earlier today talking about he was talking to some anonymous scouts and GM, and they say that he could be the second quarterback taken off the board. What have you seen out of Jalen Milroe this year that makes you go, oh, yeah, this dude is a bona fide first-round pick? Because if anything, I see a quarterback that may need to be on the bench after what transpired this week. Jalen Milroe, and not just him, but this entire Alabama team, they've been up and down all season. They're one of those teams that isn't what their record shows because you don't really know what team this is. You can see a team that looks like one of the best in all of college football, like what you did the first 3 quarters against Georgia. Then, they end up looking like an abomination in the second half against Georgia, and that makes you think that Alabama's overrated. And tonight, everything that could have went wrong for the Tide went wrong and then some. Because Jalen Milroe, when he can't run, he's ineffective, which means that the entirety of your offense is ineffective because a lot of your offensive success hinges on Jalen Milroe. When he can get going in the ground game, it helps those running backs get going. But Alabama couldn't get the run game going. They were spamming deep passes to Ryan Williams all game long. The play calling from Alabama, Kalen DeBoer, whoever his offensive coordinator is, he needs to fire him. And if he's the one calling these awful plays, he needs to give up the play calling because for the life of me, even though there was a bullshit call on that spectacular catch by Ryan Williams, why in God's green earth are you dialing up fade routes on 4th and 2? You mean to tell me that you can't run for 2 yards? You don't have any other plays that are more efficient at picking up 2 yards? This is what really irritates me with people who call plays 3rd and 2, 4th and 2. Why are we going for 15, 50-yard bombs downfield when we only need 2 yards to move the chains? This is do or die at this point. You should be worried about extending the drive, not trying to get a big play on 4th and 2. That's not smart football. I would never understand that. And I understand that being the OC, there's a lot that comes with it, but sometimes these guys just try to outthink it, and you end up having these aggressive calls that backfire when you just could have played smarter football and tried to move the chains instead of trying to go for these big shots downfield. So although it was a legal touching on that Ryan Williams touchdown, it was still an awful play call. You never should have tried to go for that in the first place. Just pick up the 2 yards, keep the drive alive, and we worry about trying to get big plays later on once we move the chains and get some more downs. But I don't know what really was called on that Ryan Williams touchdown that got called back, because they said it was a legal touching, but the dude who was out of bounds wasn't even involved in the play. And these were the same referees that, had that stupid penalty that they overturned against Georgia and Texas. I mean, this refereeing crew needs to be fired. None of these dudes should ever be allowed to ref another game in college football. I don't know the names of these officials or this officiating crew, but according to the commentators, this was the same officiating crew that was calling that Texas and Georgia game a few weeks ago. So these guys obviously just don't know the rules of the game. And if you don't know the rules of the game, then you have no business being a referee. So that bad call took a touchdown off the board for Alabama when their offense really needed it the most. They've been struggling all night, and they weren't able to score a touchdown after that. They got held to 3 points. The way Oklahoma was operating on offense, you would have thought that you was watching vintage Georgia Tech. Barely throwing the football. We're just saying we're going to run it down your throat. And this is Alabama, by the way. Alabama at the level that they recruit, you don't expect for Oklahoma, a team that just came from the Big 12, a team that has had the worst offense in the SEC all season long, to just be pounding, going to pound town on you on the ground. I mean, this was absolutely insanity. I mean, Alabama has been an inconsistent team all season long. This is the first time since 2010 they have 3 losses in a year. And I was just really surprised at how just Oklahoma just pushed Alabama around. 257 rushing yards on 50 attempts is insanity. And for Alabama, this just was a nightmare. But this season has been a nightmare, from losing to Vanderbilt to thinking that you're heading in the right direction just to fall flat in your face like this. Are you even going to be able to beat Auburn next week? I mean, listen, I'm still a Kalen DeBoer believer, but I at least thought that he could get this team to the playoffs. It's not like Nick Saban left this program in terrible state where they were due for a rebuild season, especially with the playoffs going from 4 to 12 teams. If it was still at 4, that's one thing. But it's 12. You would think that Alabama is a lock to get in, but man, this was a nightmare loss for the Tide. Shout out to my guy, Wardam ATL. Appreciate you with the $20 donation. He says Wardam Eagle. And we also appreciate the other donor for the $2 donation as well. Shout out to everybody that's tuned in. Smash that like button, subscribe, hit that bell icon if you haven't already. We talk college football, NFL, every day, all day. And right now, I'm giving my thoughts on the Week 13 chaos that has transpired in college football. Right now, I got USC, UCLA to the left of me. And right now, it looks like Lincoln Riley's about to have some tough questions to ask in the next 30 minutes if things don't turn around for the Trojans. Now, while we talk about how bad of a loss this was for Alabama, I mean, you got to give a lot of credit to Brent Venables and Oklahoma's coaching staff being able to pull off this massive upset win at home, because Brent Venables, let's be honest, if there ever was a time where he needed a win the most, it was tonight. Because before this game, there was a lot of hot seat talk around Brent Venables. There's a lot of pressure on him to nail his new offensive coordinator hire, because if Oklahoma isn't better next season, he could get canned. And they just gave this man an extension right before the season. So for Oklahoma's season to be as bad as what it's been this year, for them to come out with this win is incredibly huge. Oklahoma now is going to be bowl eligible, and there's a good possibility that you beat LSU next week, because if you're running the ball like this on Alabama, you're going to be able to do the same thing against LSU's, whose run defense is even worse than what Alabama's is. And Jackson Arnold has shown that he's a really good runner, and LSU has struggled against dual threat quarterbacks all year long. So you beat LSU, you're at 7 wins. And then whoever you play in your bowl game, you can get the 8 wins if you're able to beat them. So what looked like what could have been the worst season that this program has had in 26 years could turn into a season that gives you a lot of optimism going into 2025. Because tonight, with all of the playoff expectations that Alabama had and how well they played the last couple of games, for Oklahoma to win this game, it shows that they compete. They can compete in the SEC because they were last in the SEC standings prior to this loss. They have been the doormat of this conference all year long. And I had really high expectations for the Sooners coming into this season. I felt like this program has always been built to compete with the best of the best in this conference. And despite how things had transpired this year, I still feel no differently. They still recruit at a top 10 level. They have a really good NIL backing. And I believe Brent Venables is a really good defensive mind, as we saw tonight in this game with the way that he was able to completely neutralize Jalen Milroe. We saw Jalen Milroe a few weeks ago go for 185 on the ground and 4 rushing touchdowns. It's really hard to stop this man. And Oklahoma won this game straight off defense. And it's really hard to win any game in the SEC with the fashion that Brent Venables has had to this year with all the injuries that they've had up front. This is the best their offensive line has played all year. They've had numerous starters out at every position: wide receiver, offense, defense. I mean, they got so many freshmen playing that aren't ready to play, but they've had to be thrown into the fire due to how many injuries they sustained. Oklahoma's season was pretty much over before it even started. Once they walked out of fall camp, all of their top guys were injured. And it's hard to win in this conference, no matter how bad of an opponent you may be facing with these high amount of injuries. So for Oklahoma on senior night to go out on top and give their seniors something to hang their hat on is a huge accomplishment for Brent Venables that kind of cools out the hot seat talk, because at least now Oklahoma can say, okay, like, our first season in the SEC was tough, but at least we were bowl eligible, because this is a tough conference. This is a grind. And to be able to overcome, everything that Brent Venables has had to with the criticism, the disappointment due to the high expectations, and to still be bowl eligible in a season where there wasn't really nothing to be hopeful about for the future with him, I give him props for this win. You feel me? This is a tough conference, and Oklahoma had a really unlucky season. I mean, with all the injuries they had, if a lot of those guys were healthy, they probably end up, in maybe a situation where they got 8-9 wins. Not saying this is an excuse for everything that's gone wrong for them, but come on, man. You know how hard it is to win in this conference with all of these injuries against a lot of teams that are really good with stacked rosters. What's going on for everybody in the comments? When you got the football in your name. Brock Road, Ty Road. Somebody said I need to take a breath, man. I'm just in the mood, man. I just love talking ball. Sometimes it's hard for me to catch a breath, man, because everything that's going on in college football, it's hard for you to blink without even missing anything right now. USC's up 16-13. It's 2 minutes 21 left in the game. Boy, they better not sell this, man. It's 2nd and 8. You know how USC is with these leads, but Ohio State completely embarrassed Indiana today. They punked Indiana. As a matter of fact, that's how I want to say it. Start that over. Ohio State punked Indiana today. Indiana, there were a lot of people that were making an argument that they deserved to be in the playoffs, even though they could lose this game. If they were able to keep it close, then it shows that they're one of the best teams in college football. Well, today, Indiana was only able to compete with Ohio State for one quarter. Going into the second quarter, they were up 7-0. And, starting out the game, Indiana looked really good. It looked like, okay, like the Hoosiers, Kurt Signetti, he has these boys ready to come play, man. They forced a 3-and-out on Ohio State's first offense possession. Then when they get the ball, they drive down the field with ease. Curtis Work is looking like Tom Brady, looking efficient, deking and dumping down the field. And then they get a big goal line stand to keep Ohio State from tying it up. And then you're feeling really good about Indiana's chances of being able to hang around in this game. Well, after the first quarter, Ohio State, they took off their belt. they bent Indiana over and they just put belt the ass for the rest of this game. Indiana, they were getting blitzed to oblivion. Their offense seemed like they were doing nothing but going backwards. They finished this game with 68 passing yards and 83 rushing yards. That's a combined total of 51 yards of offense. Indiana, with how weak their schedule has been this year, with all the upsets that have happened this weekend, they still deserve to be in the playoffs, because losing to Ohio State is better than losing to Florida or losing to an unranked Auburn team or getting owned on the road by a bad Oklahoma squad. Indiana is a playoff team. Are they one of the best 12 teams in college football? I still don't know, because Ohio State and Oregon right now, they look like by far the only two elite teams in college football. And when they square off a few weeks in the Big Ten championship, that may be the game that shows us who's going to win it all, because Oregon and Ohio State from start to finish have been the most dominant teams in college football. Now, they have had their fair share of close losses, but, Ohio State, it seemed like they have yet to play their best football until they went into this game. And, Kurt Signetti, he was saying that Indiana was going to back down. They were going to be ready. And this afternoon, Ohio State, not only were they the more talented team, but they outcoached Indiana as well. Indiana, as good as they've been, Ohio State, by far, they didn't even belong on the same field as them. This was like watching a junior varsity versus varsity high school scrimmage. Indiana, they just looked like the more inferior team. They looked smaller up front. The receivers couldn't get open. Jeremiah Smith was bullying D'Angelo Pons. D'Angelo Pons is a really good cornerback. He was a freshman All-American last year, excuse me. So for him to just completely get toasted like how he did this afternoon was really surprising. And Indiana, they just obviously didn't have the athletes to compete with Ohio State. And going into the playoffs, I'm interested in seeing who they play in the first round, because I'm not saying that Indiana is going to be a one-and-done team. But what I am saying is that, depending on their matchup, is going to determine if they can advance in the playoffs or not. Because if they got to play Miami, I like Indiana's chances to win that game. But if they got to play Georgia or Texas, I don't really know. But if you get Indiana, Notre Dame, Indiana, Boise State, anybody other than Georgia, Texas, or Oregon, Ohio State, I like their chances. Hell, even if they play Penn State, I think they could get right with Penn State. But Ohio State, they just made a statement this afternoon with how they just completely just made garbage of Indiana. And it shows why your strength of schedule, although it doesn't define you as a team, it kind of does show if you're going to be battle tested for these kinds of matchups. Their average margin of wins was 23.5 points per game. And for the people that say you can only play the games that's on your schedule, yeah, that is true. But Ohio State, they've already been battle tested this year. Indiana wasn't ready for what they had coming to them in Columbus. My guy Slop said 0 goal line stand. I mean, shoot, when Will Howard threw that interception in the red zone inside of the 10, that wasn't a goal line stand. It was a goal line stand to me. Shoot, they had fumbled the football and their defense came back for goal line stand. I mean, shoot, I could have swore they had a goal line stand in that game, man. I could have swore like they tried to run it on it was like 4th and goal. They tried to run it in. Indiana stopped them, more like Will Howard threw an interception. I don't know. I could have swore there was a goal line stand. Hold on, let me check, because I could have swore when I was watching that game, it was a goal line stand. They tried to run the football early in the game in the 4th quarter, and they got stopped. Let me check before we move on. I know I'm not tripping. I could have swore they got stopped early in the game. It was a goal line stand. They got stopped on 4th and inches. Yeah. Yeah, it was a goal line stand. What you talking about, Sloops? After Indiana scored their first touchdown, Ohio State had a 15-play drive, and they got stopped on Indiana's 2. It was 4th and 1. Yeah, it was a goal line stand. I know I wasn't tripping. I was like, I know Indiana had a goal line stand in that game. I could have swore it was a goal line stand. Yeah, man. I don't know what you're talking about. It was definitely a goal line stand. If you go back and you watch the highlights, after Indiana scored their first touchdown, right after that, when Ohio State got the ball, because during that same drive, Ohio State was in like a 3rd and 35 situation, and Will Howard ends up getting like a 30-yard completion to, I think it was Cornell Tate, and then they end up going for it on 4th and 10. They get that, and then they end up driving downfield, but yet they come up short. It was a goal line stand. Like, they got stopped at Indiana's too. Yeah, I know I ain't tripping. Like, I know it was a goal line stand. Billy Napier, the future's looking really promising for his program right now down there in Gainesville. This is the first time since 2018 Florida has beaten 2 teams back to back. They beat LSU last week in upset fashion. They pull off another upset, ending Ole Miss chances of getting into the college football playoffs. This was once again another well-coached game by Billy Napier. DJ Lagway looked really impressive. 2 touchdowns. He did have an interception, but for the most part, he had a really good game. And this game gives you reason to be optimistic about Billy Napier and his future at Florida, being able to turn this program back around, because all of their young players are playing incredibly well on offense and defense. And why Florida's future looks promising for Billy Napier is because there's an old saying that goes, pressure either bursts pipes or makes diamonds. Well, after Florida had got blown out and humiliated at home by Texas A&M, the word on the street was that the boosters already had his buyout money ready, and they were already ready to make a move to get rid of him. But they come off a bye, they beat UCF, they beat Kentucky, they played Tennessee really close, and then you pull off an upset against LSU, and then you do it again against Ole Miss. Those were 2 teams that were competing for playoff spots. And Billy Napier beat them in back-to-back weeks, and he could have done the same thing against Tennessee. And when it looked like Florida was down and out, it looked like it was all but over for him down there in the swamp, Billy Napier and his coaching staff, they made great adjustments. Billy Napier saving his job isn't all due to how good DJ Lagway is, because let's not forget how bad this defense was playing to start this season. I mean, every time you watch Florida play, they always had stupid penalties. They had numerous blown coverages in the back end of their secondary. And after that loss against Texas A&M, that defensive staff, I don't know what it was. Maybe they changed play callers or whatever they did, but this defense has played incredibly better ever since. They're getting after the quarterback. There's not a lot of busted coverages anymore. This is one of the best in-season improvements as a head coach that I've seen out of any team in the SEC this year, because when it looked like Florida was about to hit rock bottom and they were about to be the stepping stool of the SEC this year, Billy Napier and his coaching staff, they made corrections, and those corrections paid off dividends. And progress isn't always linear. You know, ideally, your definition of what it means to successfully rebuild a program is that you see improvements your first 2 years, but we haven't seen that out of Billy Napier. But at the same time, just because Florida was struggling to get going doesn't mean that this program still wasn't on the verge of building something special. Look at FSU. You never want to peak too early. FSU, they were improving their first couple of years. They go undefeated in regular season play. They win the ACC title game. And then all of a sudden, a lot of their best players leave for the league, and they have a 2-win season impending this year. One of the worst seasons that they've had since, the mid-70s? So for Florida to be able to pull off 2 massive upsets back-to-back, you got to give your hats off to Billy Napier, because Florida had a really tough schedule coming into this season. One of the biggest storylines in the SEC coming into this year was if Billy Napier was going to be able to save his job. Could he at least get Florida to bowl eligibility with how much of a gauntlet their schedule was? And he was able to do that. So Billy Napier, he deserves a huge round of applause. This was an incredible coaching job by him. He made some great early season adjustments that corrected the course of Florida's season, and I'm happy that Billy Napier won this game. Now when Florida beats FSU next week, they will have a potential to have a 7-win season, which I think would be really good for the direction that program's heading in with all them young players that they have. And before we move on, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel. Give me a follow on Instagram at JT Sports_, on X at JT Sports__. If you got any mailbag questions that you would like me to answer, you can send them in the DMs and we will answer them on the future mailbag episode. And give us a 5-star review. We're not just a YouTube channel, we are a podcast. You can find us on Amazon, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcast from. The JT Sports Podcast is available. Link is down in the description down below. Now let's keep going. Now, after all of the madness that has transpired in week 13, the college football playoff picture just got incredibly murky because things are wild right now. Who's in and who's out? Because you got 7 ranked teams that fall in upset fashion, a couple of them to unranked teams. Alabama, Ole Miss, are they really done? Because how do you know if more upsets aren't going to transpire in the final week of the regular season? Because from what I've seen this year, no team is safe. No matter who you think is the best team in college football, anybody can fall any given Saturday. And I know that that's a cliche statement, but this year is like 2007 all over again. Like you got the best teams falling to teams that nobody even thought would be that good this year that have been massive disappointments. Oklahoma embarrasses Alabama at home. Ole Miss loses to Billy Napier in Florida. Texas A&M falls to an Auburn team that has found ways to lose games every single week. And, in the Big 12, Colorado, with them losing, the Big 12 is pretty much wide open. It could come down to a tiebreaker, depending on how things play out. In the ACC, we were talking about Clemson not having a chance to get into the playoffs if Miami is able to win. Maybe Clemson might not need to win the ACC to get into the playoffs, because now, that game between them and South Carolina next week is just as big as what that Texas and Texas A&M game is, because with all of the destruction that has happened in the top 10, it's opening up a situation where maybe we could get 1 3-loss team in that's not a conference champion or a team that doesn't get to their conference title game. South Carolina is on a 5-game winning streak, and they beat Texas A&M during that stretch along with Missouri. And Lenore Sellers has been the hottest quarterback in the nation at the moment. The dude has 15 total touchdowns and only 1 interception. And Clemson, yeah, they do have 2 losses. They get blown out in week 1, splattered in Mercedes-Benz Stadium by Georgia, and they get upset by Jeff Brom in Louisville. But, they're still in the rankings. And at this point, you can't be making arguments, well, this team had a tougher schedule, this team lost to who, because when you got multiple 3-loss SEC teams that you're fighting for to get into a playoffs or to make a playoff argument for, then you have to count their losses, because Alabama's losses have been really ugly. Losing to Vanderbilt and losing to Oklahoma is inexcusable. Same thing with Texas A&M, but they still have a path to get in, because if they beat Texas and they win the SEC championship, then they get an auto bid. So they still control their own destiny. But with everything that's happened, maybe we can see a world where we see a 3-loss team get in, because they're not going to put 2 Big 12 teams in this. There's no way BYU's going to get in with them losing to Arizona State today. And SMU, if they lose to Miami or Miami beats them, we still might not see both of those teams get in. We definitely see a path where Clemson, if they beat South Carolina, they can get in. That's a statement win. And South Carolina, if they beat Clemson, they can make the argument that they deserve to be in. But at this point, you really can't say that what the committee is going to do, because I don't know what the committee is going to do. The committee doesn't know what they're going to do. And if you was in the committee's shoes, be honest, you want to be able to put the right teams in the playoffs that everybody would agree with. When it comes to the eye test and the other criteria that the committee has been using to evaluate who's ranked where, It really doesn't matter with all of the upsets that has transpired. This is going to be something that comes down to after conference championship, where we're going to have a clear picture of who gets in, because there's just so many upsets happening. And right now, with everything that has happened in week 13, there is going to be at least one 3-loss team that can get in. And that can kind of be like, you ever seen like a team in March Madness in college basketball that, they start the season out slow, but then they get hot during their conference tournament and they win it, like how NC State did this past March Madness? You could see a situation where you get a team like Texas A&M that, they weren't one of the best teams in college football throughout the majority of the regular season, but, they get hot at the right time. They beat Texas next week. They beat Georgia in the title game, and there you are. Maybe you get a team that, kind of was able to take advantage of all of the chaos that was transpiring in front of them, like maybe Clemson or South Carolina. And with how good South Carolina has been, I don't think there's a single team that they don't have a shot at being able to beat on the road in the playoffs. If they got to go on the road and play Penn State, Indiana isn't built to stop South Carolina. They would get obliterated. We saw how Ohio State pushed them around. South Carolina would do the same thing, but if South Carolina has to play Penn State, that could be a more closer ball game. But if South Carolina gets to play Indiana, although it will be on the road, South Carolina could surprisingly win a playoff game and be a team that nobody expected to get into the playoffs at the start of the season, and all of a sudden they're making noise in the postseason. With how many upsets that have already happened in the regular season, there is bound to be a lot more upsets that happen in the playoffs. Everybody has been wishing for years on top of years for more parity that happened in college football. And you're getting that this season. Because at this point, you don't really know who's going to be in a national championship. We have an idea that it's going to be either Ohio State or Oregon being one of those two teams, but we don't know that for certain. Nobody's safe this year. There is no team that you can look at and say, yeah, I know they're going to be able to survive. And that's what makes this new college football playoff format so fun. This is the greatest thing that ever happened to college football. There has never been more talk around this sport than what is going on right now with the debate and the uproar that expanding the playoffs has caused, because now everybody's fighting for the argument that this conference deserves a certain amount of teams. The SEC, can they get a 3-loss team in? What if Georgia loses in the SEC championship? Are you just going to have to put a 3-loss team anyway? Because are you going to penalize Georgia for losing? But at the same time, like, Texas A&M in their own right, they got 3 losses. So, I mean, at this point, the playoffs are just completely thrown off whack by the madness that has happened in week 13. You really don't know who's going to get in at this point. You really can't say they're out, they're in, because right now there's a lot of things that the committee's going to have a hard time deciding on, because it's easy to pick, the teams that get in when you're picking from a pool of a bunch of 1-loss and undefeated teams. But this year, you got to pick from maybe a 1-loss team and a bunch of other 2-loss teams and maybe a few 3-loss teams that got really strong resumes. It looks like Colorado's chances of winning the Big 12 championship are over after falling 37-22 on the road to Kansas. They fall to 8-3 on this loss. And although there still is a shot that they can get into the title game, they need a lot of help to happen for that to transpire. And this snaps their 4-game win streak. And against Kansas today, Colorado just played their worst football. Kansas scored on every possession. They were moving the field. They were moving the ball up and down the field with ease. Their run game was really just obliterating Colorado's defensive line, as well as how Colorado's defensive line has played this season. I mean, they just had no way to stop Kansas on the ground. They had 331 total yards rushing. Devin Neal, 37 carries, 207, 3 touchdowns. Jalen Daniels was doing this thing as well. He also had a really good game passing. Colorado offensively, you would think that they would be able to hang with Kansas because they do have the most talented offense in this conference with all the receivers that they have, but They were just too inefficient. They were too dependent on the big play. You had two big touchdowns by Travis Hunter. One went for 51 yards. The other one went for 26, but they were unable to move the chains. They were 3-7 on third down. They had hella costly penalties, and they had no run game. But overall, despite this loss and maybe Colorado not being able to get into the playoffs, this still is a really great season. And it really frustrates me that you got the haters who have been quiet and haven't said a peep the last 2 months that are now coming out and chirping their mouths when, there's really nothing to hate on when it comes to Colorado. This team isn't overrated. They didn't get humbled. If anything, they humbled all of you haters out there who said that they were going to be nothing more but a 5-6 win team at best. And then when they end up over exceeding those expectations, then you want to move the goalposts and say, well, they just play in a weak conference. Like, it doesn't matter. Colorado's season, despite if they make it to the title game or not, is still a mild success. This was a program that, before Deion Sanders arrived, they've been irrelevant for the last 2 decades. Colorado hasn't made as much noise as what they've made this season since the freaking mid-90s with Eric Bieniemy at running back. This was a one-loss program not too long ago, and for them to go from what they were before Deion Sanders arrived to what they are now and getting Julian Lewis, all these big-time recruits, is a lot of growth that has been made within this program that shows you that Deion Sanders has done and taken the right steps to make Colorado a program that is going to be talked about for years to come, and they're going to compete for championships. I do believe that eventually we will hear Colorado in the national championship conversation. I just feel like this season overall was a great stepping stone for Deion Sanders because this season he had to show everybody that he isn't just all talk. He isn't all hype. He had to show people that he actually does know what he's doing as a head coach because at times this year I questioned if Deion was the most qualified, and a lot of people did, but Deion Sanders, his method of how he has rebuilt this program has been often criticized. Well, the experiment has worked out. And there may not be another head coach that can pull off the turnaround that Deion has done in Boulder the same way he has. Deion Sanders, what he's building in Colorado is really special. And this loss to Kansas doesn't put a stain on what has already been a successful season. You got Travis Hunter. Regardless if you feel he's going to win the Heisman or not, Deion Sanders developed this dude. When Travis Hunter committed to Jackson State, there were people saying, oh, that's a bad decision. How are you going to make it to the NFL? You're going to put your trust in Deion to develop you over a guy like Nick Saban. Well, Travis Hunter and Shedeur Sanders are going to be top 5 picks. And regardless of how you feel about those guys, those are really talented players. And you got to be a good coach to help people reach their potential. There's been plenty of 5-stars that have had a lot of hype that come and go in college football. There's a 5-star linebacker that just transferred from Alabama. So I really don't understand the hate. I just think if you're hating on Colorado, whether you like them or not, bro, it's just lame. What is it about them, like, not being humble or anything like that? They're no better than any other team in college football. When they win, they celebrate. When they lose, sometimes they may not handle it the right way, but we're all humans. There's fights that happen in every game. It's just, the hate is unwarranted and it's unnecessary. And if anything, we should be celebrating Deion Sanders for the success that he's having at Colorado, because what a lot of you haters are overlooking is how Deion Sanders has helped grow and raise the popularity of college football. He's done the equivalent to what Taylor Swift has done to the NFL. He's brought the NFL, or she's brought the NFL to a different audience. Same thing with Deion Sanders. You got people that are watching Colorado play worldwide because of Deion Sanders. He's broadened the appeal and the reach of college football to audiences that they weren't touching. Every Colorado game that gets played is top 10 in viewership every single week. I think what Deion Sanders has done has been really impressive, and how he's helped grow the sport, being a great ambassador for college football. I don't think that the hate is warranted, and I just feel like it's really lame, the people that just try to shit on Colorado for this one loss when you've been waiting for this moment, when really you only waiting for this moment because you just wanted to find a room to kick Dion when he's down because you haven't been able to do so this year. There's no reason anybody should be hating on Colorado. Like, what are you hating for? They proved you and everybody wrong. Nobody expected them to make it to the Big 12 championship before the season but me. I was the only person that picked Colorado to go this far and make it to the playoffs. So for the expectations that Colorado had going into this year, they've met them and crushed them with flying colors. And I'm looking forward to seeing whoever they play in their bowl game. I got a few more things I want to hit on before I get up on out of here. I got a message to the College Football Playoff Committee. Stop being cowards and put South Carolina in the playoffs. If the Gamecocks beat Clemson next week, they deserve to be one of the 12 teams in the dance, man, because you can't tell me, based off how South Carolina has played the last month, that they haven't looked like one of the 12 best teams in the nation, man. They currently are 18th in the CFP rankings. They are 8-3, and they had the fourth strongest schedule in all of college football. So when you play a schedule this tough and you're 8-3 and you have several key wins against Texas A&M and Missouri, who are ranked inside of the CFP top 25, you have a strong resume that you can make the argument for South Carolina being in the playoffs, although they are a 3-loss team, because if you beat Clemson, that means that you will have another big win to add on to your resume against another team that is competing for a spot in the playoffs. And with how well Lenore Sellers has played the last 5 games, he has been the hottest quarterback in college football. He's had 15 total touchdowns and only 2 interceptions in the last 5 games that Carolina has won. And their defense is also outstanding as well. They got a really good pass rush. They got a really experienced secondary. And if the refs never would have cheated them against LSU, they would only have 2 losses right now. South Carolina is one of the best 12 teams in the nation right now. If South Carolina gets into the playoffs, I could see them beating Penn State on the road. I could see them beating Indiana. I could see them beating Miami. With football, it's not about how you start. It's about how you finish. And the goal is to play your best football all season long, but every team has peaks and valleys throughout the season. And they say you want to play your best football late in the year because it's easy to carry that momentum over into the postseason. And right now, if there was a wild card team, if you had to pick from any 3-loss team right now, who could make the most noise in the playoffs, it would be South Carolina. And I'm not talking about potentially a 3-loss Georgia if they lose in the SEC championship. I'm talking about picking from any pool of the 3-loss teams that won't be in the conference championship game. Which of those teams could be the most dangerous in the playoffs? Depending on the matchup, they could upset Tennessee. They could upset Miami. They could beat Penn State on the road. A lot of people love to say, well, these Southern teams are going to struggle if they have to make a road trip to Penn State or Indiana. Like, South Carolina is a team that's built to win in those conditions because they're built to run the football and lean into their defense. Their offense is better than what Penn State's offense is. South Carolina is a really good team. If you are on the playoff committee and you are listening to this right now, put South Carolina in the playoffs, you cowards, because that's what it would be. It would be a cowardly move if South Carolina beats Clemson next week and they get left out of the playoffs. They will have a 6-game win streak. That's one of the longest win streaks in the country. And you can't say, well, they haven't played anybody. They lost to this team. They lost to that team. Like, everybody has lost to somebody either mid or bad in the SEC or, in any other conference. For crying out loud, Clemson lost to Louisville. So if you're going to harp on South Carolina for losing to Alabama, losing to LSU, those teams not really being that good, then you got to hold the same energy with all of the other teams that you're making the argument to get into the playoffs over South Carolina. Tennessee lost to Arkansas, and they were able to play South Carolina this year. So if you're going to harp on who South Carolina has lost to and not talk about the impact of the wins, then I kind of feel like you're making a mute argument against South Carolina. Who cares if those losses happen early in the season? If anything, it's better to lose early in the season than it is to lose late in the season, because now with South Carolina playing their best football, actually winning games late, they can take advantage of all of the madness that has happened in front of them, which has given them an opportunity to potentially have an argument to get into the 12-team playoffs. And really, if you are going to still rank a 3-loss Ole Miss and a 3-loss Alabama over South Carolina, I think it's really criminal. These teams lost to unranked opponents late in the year. It's one thing to lose early because you can make up ground for it, but you just can't have 3 losses and try to make up ground late in the season. You deserve to be in the back of the line behind the teams that have actually been winning late in the season. South Carolina, put them in the playoffs, please, because I want to see the Beamer boys in the postseason. I think they could make a somewhat of a Cinderella run if you put them in there, man. I would like South Carolina favored over a handful of teams. And I know if we do hypothetical odds, they would be probably like a 6-7 point or more favored against Penn State or whatnot. But I really don't care, man. South Carolina is one of those teams that F what the statistics show, F about who's favored on the neutral field. South Carolina is one of those teams that you don't want to play them because you're going to be in a brawl. You want to know what's crazy to me? With all of the madness that has happened in Week 13, Ole Miss getting upset by Florida, Alabama getting upset by Oklahoma, now Georgia has punched their ticket into the SEC championship. And what's funny is how a few weeks ago, we thought that it was over for Georgia. After they got bullied and tossed around like a cold salad by Ole Miss 28-10, this team, it was some serious questions if they were even going to avoid having a third loss before the conference championship game. But now, with everything that has happened, we now have a better understanding of what the SEC is as a whole right now. And what it is an absolute brawl. It's chaos every single week in this conference. But the team that clearly is going to win it is going to be Georgia. Georgia has been the most battle-tested team all season long. And not just because they played the toughest schedule in college football. It's been because they have found ways to win and to survive having potential ugly losses. Losing to Alabama on the road wasn't an ugly loss. It's tough to win on the road in the SEC, but they were able to bounce back and beat Texas, who still is ranked inside of the top 5. And then they were able to beat a really good Tennessee team who probably is going to be in the playoffs now with all of the upsets that have happened in this conference now. So Georgia has beaten 3 playoff teams this year. Okay, you were able to beat Texas. You were able to beat Tennessee. And then you were able to obliterate Clemson, who potentially could sneak into the playoffs as maybe a unprecedented 3-loss team that nobody saw coming. But either way, they beat 3 teams that are ranked inside of the CFP top 25. And with how Georgia has looked at their worst, being able to beat Texas despite Carson Beck throwing 3 interceptions, it shows you how good this team is. Is it ugly how they win a lot of times? Yes, it is. But style points doesn't make a good team. What makes a good team is, can you win or not? And that's what Georgia has the ability to do. They know how to survive and advance. And that's why I'm picking Georgia to win the SEC championship, regardless of if they have to play Texas A&M or Texas. I don't trust Steve Sarkisian to be able to beat Kirby Smart. Quinn Ewers was seeing ghosts the last time these 2 teams played, and I don't think the adjustments are going to be all that different. Quinn Ewers is not good enough to beat Georgia's defense. And Georgia, as inconsistent as what they've been offensively, their defense has still been able to keep them in games, and their offense does just enough to win them. Can they win a national championship? I don't know, but Georgia is not a team that right now you should underestimate. To even get to this point is somewhat of a miracle, because at one point, you would have thought Alabama was the best team in the conference, A&M was the best team in the conference, Texas was the best team in the conference, but when it's all said and done, and all the chips have fell on the table, Georgia is still here. Georgia had the toughest schedule of any team in this conference. They had to go on the road against 3 teams that were in the top 5 odds to win this conference right behind them. Alabama, Ole Miss, Texas. What Georgia has done deserves a lot of praise. They went on the road and took care of business against the Auburn team that, yeah, they may be down, but it's tough to win in Jordan-Hare Stadium. Like, Georgia is going to win the SEC championship. And the job that Kirby Smart has done this year reminds me of what Nick Saban did last year with Alabama in his final season before he hung it up, because there was a point last year when it didn't look like Alabama was going to be a playoff team. They were struggling to beat USF, and you had the quarterback concerns, but then Jalen Milroe starts getting consistent, and all of a sudden, Alabama makes it to the SEC championship game. They upset Georgia, and you can argue about if they deserve to get in over FSU or not, but they did give Michigan a really competitive game. They came really close to making it to another national championship, despite them having what we thought was the worst team ever under Nick Saban. And Kirby Smart has done the same. When you compare this year's Georgia's team to the past 3 Georgia teams that Kirby Smart has had, this is the worst of the bunch. This Georgia team may not even be all that better from the team he had his first year that he took this job. And yet, he was still able to have this team in the SEC championship again against all the odds, with a chance to get into the playoffs and maybe compete for another national championship. Never count out the heart of a champion. Georgia is my pick to win the SEC this year. Shout out to my guy. Whoa, he says, I don't see him getting the best of Sark twice, but you may be right. With some time to prepare, Sark a tough out. Clint Ewers plays. Sloop says Milroe doesn't matter now. Shout out to everybody that's tuned in. I got one more thing that I want to get into before I get up on out of here. The SEC really got humbled today. They had 3 playoff teams that got upset by unranked opponents. Ole Miss falls on the road in the swamp to Florida. Texas A&M loses an overtime shootout to Auburn on the road. And Alabama walks into a nightmare in Norman. And I defended this conference's integrity and honor for the past week. I was saying how the SEC is so tough that you can't put a 1-loss Indiana over any 2-loss SEC team, because if they had to play Alabama or Georgia or Ole Miss schedule, they would have 4 more losses. Well, when you lose to unranked teams, that argument now becomes mute, because now you can't criticize a team like Indiana for playing a weak schedule, because although you can say that Alabama, Ole Miss, and Texas A&M have had better wins than Indiana, at least Indiana was able to beat the teams that they were supposed to beat. You can't say that about Alabama. Oklahoma has been dog water all year long. Their offense hasn't had a pulse. Tonight, they went for over $100 against you. And they were just absolutely destroying your offense. Jalen Milroe had 3 interceptions in that game. Ole Miss, there's no excuse for you losing to an unranked Florida team on the road. And Texas A&M, Auburn, you lost to a team that has found new innovative ways to lose every single week. The SEC got humbled tonight. And even though I'm what people call a SEC fanboy, because I've grown up in the South, I've mostly followed the SEC conference in its entirety since 2010, but I do keep up with the rest of college football. But for the amount of people that were talking noise about how good the SEC is, you can say that there are a lot of quality teams in this conference, but this conference lacks any great teams. So therefore, although the SEC isn't as deep as even though the SEC is deeper than the Big Ten, the ACC, and all of the other P4 conferences out there, at least the Big Ten has 2 elite teams, Oregon and Ohio State. You can't say that about the SEC this year. You got a lot of good teams, but you don't have any of these, 3-loss, 2-loss SEC teams that you look at and say, oh yeah, they're great. They're elite teams. The SEC, they can be the toughest conference in college football, but they also could be the most overrated in a sense. Because now that I think about it, you got a bunch of good teams. But just because you got a bunch of good teams doesn't mean that all of them deserve the right to be in the 12-team college football playoffs. Because just because you're in the toughest conference doesn't mean that all of your 2- and 3-loss teams are any of the top 12 teams in the sport. You know, losing to teams that you're supposed to beat doesn't show that you're one of the best teams in the nation. You know, what shows that you're one of the best teams in the nation is that you're able to take care of business no matter who you play. And you don't just say, well, I played a tougher schedule, I deserve to get in over this team who's played a weaker schedule. Because now, with you losing the unranked teams and Indiana blowing out all the unranked teams that they played with a point differential of 23.5, you know, Indiana has a right to say they're one of the 12 best teams in the sport. Because, yeah, we didn't play as many tough teams as what you did, but at least we're able to beat the teams that we were favored to beat. Can't say that about Alabama, Ole Miss, and Texas A&M, even though they still have a path to get in. So the SEC got humbled tonight. Because if this conference is as good as what I was hyping it out to be, and many defenders of this conference have, then you will have to agree somewhat and come to the middle in terms of discussing just how truly good this conference is. Because you can be the deepest conference, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you deserve to have all these teams in just for the sake of this conference being deep, because you should at least be able to take care of the worst teams in this conference. And there's not really a big gap, as we've seen with what has happened tonight in talent, between the best teams in this conference record-wise and the worst teams. The SEC has been a close equivalent to what the NFL is. The gap in talent isn't necessarily all that big. All it really comes down to is, can you play your best football every week? And it doesn't matter if you're a 2-win team in the SEC, you're more than capable of beating any of the teams that are better than you record-wise if you're able to play your A game. And all of these teams recruit insanely well. The SEC has the most teams ranked in the CFP for a reason, because most of these teams are ranked in the top 25 when it comes to the current recruiting classes. So when everybody was hoping for parity to happen in college football, when the playoffs got expanded to more teams, what has happened is that with more teams being added, you had more SEC teams to pick from, but you getting rid of divisions made it so where the SEC became a gauntlet. And eventually, there was a time where we thought there was going to be 7, 10-2 SEC teams, and we were going to have to flip a coin to see if who gets into the SEC championship. But everything has already played out. You know, at this point, there is teams that you can look at and definitively say, yeah, they have to be in. You can't leave them out, because no 3-loss Ole Miss Alabama team should be in. You lost too late in the season. You rather lose early in the season like South Carolina did and get hot late so you can take advantage of the teams that fall off late in the season. The best teams don't always play their best football early. The best teams that are the most dangerous are the teams that play their best football late in the season, because that's what matters the most. And let's just be honest. College football now is the 2.0 of the NFL. And in the NFL, when we've seen teams like the New York Giants, when they went on Super Bowl runs with Eli Manning, they got hot late. You know, there's always a few teams that get hot late in the season and go on runs in the postseason. And everybody's talking about these 3-loss Ole Miss, Alabama teams. We're not talking enough about South Carolina. You know, South Carolina is a prime definition of how you can be one of the best teams in the nation, but you didn't play your best football early. You played your best football late. This is it for this episode of JT Sports Live. I appreciate everybody for tuning in. Before we get up on out of here, I want to shout out everybody that's tuned in. Shout out to DYM. Shout out to Sloop. Shout out to Prince. Signbald L. Shout out to my guy Pays and Plays podcast. Shout out to M Spark. Shout out to Soul Tire. Shout out to everybody that tuned in into tonight's late episode. I wasn't expecting to get this many people on, being honest, because it was so late. I'm like, I don't think too many people going to tune in at 1 o'clock in the morning, but y'all did. So I appreciate that. Before we get up on out of here, if you enjoyed tonight's episode, give me a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast from. Apple, Spotify, Amazon. The audio version of this podcast is available. And we aren't just the college football channel. We do post NFL as well. This is a platform where if you're just a football nerd like me and you just love the NFL and college football, this is the place for you. But If you only care about college football, there's enough college football content out there for you to enjoy. Same thing, vice versa, if you're an NFL fan. So I appreciate everybody that's tuned in, and shout